Part 1. The Aftermath of Fire. Sergeant Elias Ghost Kaine moved through the wreckage of what had been a company, 1st Cavalry, with the methodical calm of a man calculating inventory in a ruined warehouse. The ambush had been instantaneous and total. A 40 rocket salvo followed by crossfire that ripped through the landing zone like a chainsaw through balsa wood. Kaine hadn't fought his way out. He had simply been sheltered by the collapse of a storage hooch, deafened and covered in red dust, and the visceral remains of his radio man, Private Sanchez. Now, 2 hours past the killing, the air still tasted of burned cordite and rendered fat. He found Private Miller wedged beneath a tangled root system, alive but barely, his abdomen shredded by shrapnel, leaking life onto the unforgiving mud. Kaine's internal clock had stopped, replaced by a hyper-awareness of the silence. The enemy had vanished, leaving only the flies and the evidence of their efficiency. Kaine dragged Miller half a click up a steep, slick slope to firebase Judas Dash, a derelict, sandbag observation post meant for 4, now housing 2 ghosts. Judas was nothing more than 3 crumbling walls and a roof patch of corrugated iron, surrounded by triple-strand wire that looked more like decorative garden fencing. He radioed command, Captain Hayes, miles away and insulated by static, relaying the grim casualty report and Miller's critical status. The response was clinical: heavy cloud cover, ghost. Weather hold, seat tights. Dust off ETA 12 hours, maybe more. Kaine stared at the blood on his knuckles. 12 hours of silence, cradling a dying man, waiting for the inevitable return of the men who had just erased his company. He didn't feel relief at surviving. He felt the metallic, crushing weight of failure, a failure that now sat in his gut like the ghost of the shrapnel he was sure he had somehow absorbed. Part 2. The geometry of waiting. The 12 hours stretched into 24, then 36. Firebase, Judas, became Kaine's entire universe, a shrinking, claustrophobic circle of dirt and fear. Kaine became obsessed with the geometry of the perimeter. Every sandbag had to be straight. Every strand of wire had to be taut. His M16 had to be cleaned and re-cleaned until the barrel reflected the weak light like polished glass. This ritual was the only thing preventing the silence from fracturing his mind. Miller lay in the darkest corner, his breathing shallow, punctuated by weak, rattling coughs. Kaine had only 3 vials of morphine left, enough to keep Miller from screaming, but not enough to numb the reality of the infection setting in. The jungle outside was relentless, pressing its heavy, humid weight against the wire. Kaine could not distinguish the sound of rustling leaves from the sound of an approaching boot. He began to whisper the names of his dead men into the void, listing their flaws and virtues, trying to keep their memory solid so they wouldn't become indistinguishable echoes in the jungle's vast acoustic chamber. He paced the 3 steps across the firebase, a caged animal waiting for the next meal or the final blow. He realized that during the ambush, the adrenaline had made the world simple: kill or be killed. The waiting, however, introduced complexity, doubt, and the horrifying leisure to replay every mistake, every missed warning, every sound that might have saved them. Part 3. The Broken Promise. Dawn of the 3rd day brought no relief, only a denser, suffocating layer of fog that clung to the hilltop. Command called on the PRC-25, the voice of Captain Hayes tinny and distant, apologizing for the further delay. Priority shift, Ghost. We got heavy activity north of Hugh. Air assets pulled. We'll try a fast mover tonight, but I can't promise a drop zone. Kaine felt a cold, sharp rage, not at Hayes, but the military machinery that prioritized the bulk of the war over 2 exposed lives. He wanted to scream, to shatter the radio, but he held the silence, answering only with clipped acknowledgments. He became acutely aware of a sound that wasn't there, a low-frequency hum vibrating in his chest, which he interpreted as the shrapnel moving within his body. A restless, metallic ghost eager to witness his destruction. To combat the paranoia, Kaine dug. He expanded the main firing pit, deepening the trench until he was below ground level, treating the earth like a protective blanket. Miller, momentarily lucid, watched him with wide, feverish eyes. "Sarge," Miller rasped, his voice a dried leaf. "They know we're here, don't they? They're just waiting for the weather to clear so they can see us bleed." Kaine stopped digging, the shovel handle slick with sweat. He looked out at the fog, realizing that Miller had voiced the truth. The NVA weren't afraid of the weather. They were leveraging it, letting time do the killing. Part 4. Inventory of Ghosts. Kaine's mind became a ledger of the dead. He remembered Sergeant Dale Iron Johnson, who had always kept his coffee hot and his temper cold, vaporized instantly by the initial blast. He remembered Private First Class Rico, who swore he'd survived the war just to open a bakery in Detroit, his body riddled, twitching in the mud. Kaine sat facing the sandbags, methodically checking the dwindling supplies. 3 days of rations for one man, less than a day's water, and the final 2 vials of morphine. He categorized the remaining ammunition like precious relics: 12 fragmentation grenades, 6 smoke for rifle flares, and 8 magazines of 5.56 millimeters. The most terrifying inventory was the lack of anything to occupy his mind other than the past. He began hallucinating a faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the base of the antenna mast, the sound of an enemy sapper scraping away the dirt, inch by terrifying inch. He rushed out, M16 raised, only to find the mast perfectly still, coated in glistening dew. He decided he needed to use the last of the morphine for Miller immediately, gambling that if the wait extended beyond another day, Miller would die agonizingly regardless, and he would need the clarity for himself. He administered the shot, watching the relief flood Miller's face, a temporary peace Kaine deeply envied. The sacrifice of the last medicine felt like sealing a pact with the jungle. Either they would be out tomorrow, or neither of them would. Part 5. The Ritual of Maintenance. Driven by the fear of inertia, Kaine enforced a rigid, self-imposed ritual. At 0700, he polished the blade of his K-bar knife. At 0930, he checked the claymores, ensuring they were aimed precisely at the 2 main approaches. At 1100, he checked Miller's pulse, whispering encouragement to the barely conscious man. At 1300, he scrubbed the 2 remaining mess kits, even though they hadn't eaten solid food in days. These tasks, though meaningless in the face of annihilation, were vital psychological bulwarks. He needed control where he had none. The most harrowing part of the ritual was the perimeter check at 2100. The darkness in the A Shau was absolute, a thick velvet shroud that swallowed sound and light. Kaine crawled on his stomach, a few inches from the wire, feeling the damp earth, smelling the thick, sickly sweet odor of tropical decay. He was looking not for movement, but for disruption. A snapped twig that should have been straight, a clump of moss dislodged. Tonight, near the south corner, he found it. A single, thin root, freshly severed, neatly laid against the earth beneath the wire. It was too clean to be accidental. An animal would have chewed, a storm would have ripped. This was deliberate. A sapper, probing the perimeter, confirming the numbers, perhaps even leaving a marker. Kaine's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against the dirt. The waiting was over. The game had just changed from defense to silent offense. Part 6. The Unseen Watcher. The discovery of the severed root validated Kaine's paranoia. They were being watched, studied, perhaps even counted. The NVA weren't rushing. They were patient hunters savoring the kill. Kaine doubled his security measures, moving like a shadow around the perimeter. He rigged 3 trip flares with razor wire at ankle height, hoping to catch an unwary foot. He began speaking aloud, addressing the unseen observer. "Come on, take the shot." He'd whisper into the darkness, attempting to draw an impulsive attack, anything to break the tension of the waiting. He knew they wouldn't fall for it. The only reply was the ceaseless drone of insects and the slow, heavy drip of water collecting on the leaves. Kaine used his last charge of C4, a plastic explosive brick, to rig a silent booby trap inside the old, collapsed bunker entrance 20 yards downhill, a place he knew any probing force would use for cover. He attached the detonator cord and ran it back to his firing position, ensuring the trigger was a hair-trigger tripwire, nearly invisible in the gloom. This was his ace, a final act of control violence. He didn't want the NVA to attack him head-on. He wanted them to walk in the ghosts he had already prepared. The exhaustion was setting in, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. He saw movement where there was none and constantly tasted the metallic tang of Sanchez's blood. He knew the shrapnel ghost was feeding on his sanity, growing stronger with every delayed promise of rescue. Part 7. Decoding the silence. Kaine leaned against the damp sandbags, the radio headset crackling with useless static. It was morning again, the fourth day, the silence now, so profound it felt like a physical pressure on his eardrums. He understood the NVA strategy now. They were employing the psychological weapon of the false calm. They had confirmed Kaine's position, confirmed his reduced strength, and now they were waiting for him to make the mistake of desperate movement or collapse from sleep deprivation. He observed the jungle canopy meticulously. Mid-morning, while scanning the deep gloom between two banyan trees, Kaine noticed a tiny, unnatural element. It was a smooth, fist-sized carving of a bird fashioned from pale wood, dangling almost invisibly from a low vine. A signature marker left by local NVA units, denoting surveillance, perhaps even a pre-planned mortar target coordinate. A cold sweat broke over Kaine. They weren't just watching. They had codified his position for supporting fire. The attack was imminent. He realized that the fight in the LZ 3 days ago was brutal but swift. The true battle was the 4-day mental siege, designed to turn him into a shivering, disorganized wreck before the final push. Kaine carefully marked the bird's position with a thin strand of medical tape from his kit, knowing that was the spot the mortars would sight on. He resolved to be 30 feet away when the first round impacted. Part 8. Miller's confession. Miller stirred late that afternoon, surprisingly lucid, his fever momentarily breaking. He signaled Kaine over with a weak hand. Kaine crouched, expecting a request for water or a plea for extraction. Instead, Miller stared directly at him, his eyes heavy with a final, terrifying clarity. "Sarge," he whispered, the sound scratchy and full of effort. "That ambush. I dropped the smoke grenade, sir. The one for the LZ marking. I was shaking. I fumbled it. Fell short. We got hit before they knew where the perimeter was." Kaine stared blankly. The immense failure that killed his men was not due to some grand tactical mistake or overwhelming enemy force, but a fumbled, sweaty grenade. It was a mundane, horrifying triviality. This confession, delivered in the dying man's final moments of lucidity, carried more crushing weight than the roar of the ambush itself. Kaine felt the shrapnel ghost tighten its grip. He reached out and squeezed Miller's shoulder gently. "It's okay, Miller. It's okay." Miller smiled weakly, the ghost of shame passing from his face. Minutes later, his breathing slowed, then stopped. Kaine closed Miller's eyes, the task performed with the detachment of a mortician. He took Miller's dog tags and clipped them next to his own. He was truly alone now, the last man standing, with no one left to protect, only himself left to save. He had lost the first battle, the men, and survived the second, the waiting. Now, the final test was about to begin. Part 9. The Ghost Manifests. Kaine didn't bury Miller. He couldn't afford the time or the sound. He wrapped the body in a poncho liner and moved it into the deepest part of the observation pit, dedicating all his energy to preparation. He retrieved the heavy M60 machine gun and positioned it behind the main firing slot, checking the 100-round belt feeds one last time. Just as the shadows deepened, a sound broke the protracted silence, a sound that cut through the humidity like ice water. The faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of distant mortar tubes being set up. It was precisely what the wooden bird had predicted. They were organizing the final softening barrage. The waiting was violently over. Kaine checked the C4 tripwire connection one last time, tightening the slack. He moved to his alternate firing position, away from where he knew the first mortars would fall. He felt a sudden, profound calm. The ambiguity, the debilitating uncertainty of the last 4 days had vanished, replaced by the simple, immediate objective of survival. The shrapnel ghost in his chest was quiet now. It thrived on fear and inaction, not controlled violence. He felt the cold, hard logic of the weapon in his hands, realizing that the waiting hadn't destroyed him. It had stripped him down, leaving only the necessary gears of the machine. Part 10. The Arrival and the Reckoning. The first mortar round slammed into the exact spot where Kaine had been resting hours earlier, exploding the sandbags and spraying dust and splintered wood everywhere. Kaine opened fire instantly with the M60, not at a target, but straight into the jungle line, tracers stitching a fiery path through the darkness, drawing the enemy's fire. The secondary NVA assault wave hit the perimeter moments later, heralded by shouting and the distinctive crackle of AK-47 fire. Kaine hammered them, the M60 roaring a symphony of defiance that cut through the jungle din. He heard the metallic snap of the C4 tripwire engaging, a massive, subterranean concussion that shook the earth, followed by terrified screams from the downhill entrance. He had bought crucial time. Then, impossibly, piercing through the cloud cover and the gunfire, came the distant, pulsing thwop 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 of a Huey nearing the drop zone. Command had finally pushed through the extraction, triggered by the sound of the engagement. Kaine emptied a belt of M60 fire to suppress the closest enemy positions, then swung the machine gun onto its bipod and grabbed Miller's body. He had promised to keep him safe until extraction. Dragging the lifeless weight, Kaine scrambled out of the ruined firebase just as the Huey dropped low, its landing lights cutting through the smoke. He threw Miller onto the deck of the chopper, jumped in behind him, and collapsed, the roar of the rotor blades deafening. The combat was over, the waiting finally resolved. Kaine looked down at his blood-soaked hands, the shrapnel ghost temporarily silenced by the overwhelming noise of his rescue.